Hello and welcome to the OASYS Admin Basics course. This class is geared towards both document and tracer system administrators and takes a look at the basic navigation and programming of the administrative side in order to get your call recording solution working for your company in the way that it should. The topics that we'll be discussing in this session are the following. First and foremost, once we talk about downloading the software itself, we're going to do a quick nickel tour of the OASYS desktop client. The OASYS desktop client is a lightweight application that you can download on your agent's computers in order to give them some control of their recordings while they're taking place in real time. This desktop client piece is looked at in greater detail in our basic user course, but we're going to focus on this application and the implications that it has about programming on the administrative side. Once we then transition into the full-blown interface of the OASYS system that we call the Management Studio, that's where we'll take a look at the remaining topics for our admin class. First, we're going to be taking a look at some system verification points. Just some places where you can go inside of the software to make sure that your system is in fact up and running and recording calls as it should be. On this front, I'm going to show you both a proactive and a reactive tool. Very proactively, I'm going to show you how to check on your ports, so we can see those devices that are being recorded inside of your company and make sure they're behaving as they should. On a more reactive front, I'm going to show you how to program some alarms. Alarms, as their name implies, are reactive notifications that will be sent to you if an error should ever occur inside of our software. Once we take a look at those verification points, the next topic of interest is going to be the creation of lists and call filters. Lists and call filters are essentially groupings in the software that we can create for numerous programming purposes. Specifically, these groupings will be used for all of the remaining topics that we'll be discussing in today's administrative course. Lists and other call filters are just ways that we can segment out specific phone numbers, extensions, ACD information, account codes, times of day, or anything else specific that you would want to use to do your programming of the various topics below. Once we program those groups that will be of interest to your company, the next major topic that we're going to discuss are backup and archive settings. Backup and archive, very important to your OASYS call recording solution. This is how we make sure there's always room on the hard drive for the new calls coming into your company, while at the same time making sure we safely store all those old calls that might be still important to your organization. Whether you're bound to keep those for legal purposes or they're just nice to have, we're going to make sure that you keep those recordings that are going to be of interest to your company. Following our discussion of backup and archive, we're going to take a look at programming some recording rules. Recording rules is just where we tell the system which calls are important to keep and which calls we can delete in the first place. So if you only want to keep a segment of the recordings inside of your organization, we can set a number of rules to tell the system which calls are important and which calls are less important inside of the software. By default, all of the calls that our system is aware of will be recorded. If that's the way you want your system to perform, you can certainly turn a deaf ear to this discussion. Just keep in mind that there are various other ways that you can tell the system to record and not record. If you want to get more granular, this discussion's right up your alley, because we'll tell the system how to keep calls from the sales department, but delete calls from the president, vice president, or CEO's extensions. Things of that nature. Once we take a look at those recording rules, the next major topic we'll look at in this basic admin class are some after-call actions. After-call actions are actions that can take place immediately after a call is done processing in the software. So if you want specific notifications to happen for individuals based on various call types, or if you just want special things to happen for API integrations or informative purposes, we can set up a bevy of after-call actions that can do with your recordings after the fact what you want to be done. Last but not least in this basic admin class, we're going to take a look at creating some custom call columns. Call columns are places where you can attach information to your recordings. There are numerous call columns waiting for you out of the cardboard as soon as we get the system installed, but many industries like to customize those call columns to attach specific pieces of information to the recordings that are important to their business needs. So we'll be taking a look at how to customize those call columns so you can have specific things of interest attached to your recordings that make sense for your business model. Those then are the topics that we'll be discussing in this basic admin course. All of these features and functionalities are available in both the document and tracer software solutions, so this class will pertain to all system administrators. To go ahead and get the ball rolling, the first thing I want us to do is take a look at how we download the OASYS software in the first place. And that's going to be done off of a web page. Your system is going to have a unique web page from which you'll be able to download both the Management Studio and/or the desktop client, depending on what your needs would be. The web page that you're going to browse to in order to get the OASYS software on your computer, your PC, your laptop, whatever it is you use on a day-to-day basis inside of your company, is going to be dependent on the server that's under your roof. The web address for every single server that we place in the world is going to be unique. My URL is above. I'll scratch it out though, because if you're a note taker, it's not going to do you a darn bit of good. In order to connect to your OASYS call recording server that's been installed for your organization, you're going to need to know one of two pieces of information about that server. You're either going to need to know the IP address, whatever IP address it snagged when you put it on the network, 192.168.4.45, or you're going to need to know the full computer name of that server. Again, because these are unique for every system that we place in the world, I don't have a clue what yours is going to be. So you'll need to go to your OASYS server and retrieve one of these two pieces of information, or get it from a fellow IT person or the reseller who installed the system. Once you have one of those two pieces of information, you simply open up an Internet Explorer browser session, any computer on your local network, and you'll type in one of those two pieces of information. In my case, I always use the name of the server. So Triton House is the training server that we're going to be using for our programming in the administrative course. That's the name I'll type in. http:// the full name of that server. I could, though, just as easily have typed in the IP address, 192.168.4.45. Once you type in one of those pieces of information, you go ahead and hit enter. The browser will self-populate, and you'll be brought to this download software page. Essentially, what you're doing is browsing to your OASYS call recording solution. When you browse to that server, it looks back at you and says, you must want to download my software. And it gives you the option to download one or two pieces of software, depending on what your needs would be. You can either download the OASYS Management Studio, which we consider the true backbone interface of your recording solution. It's where we're going to do almost all of the administrative programming. It's also the core interface where you'll go to look for and listen to and play around with recordings that have been captured in your software. And you also get the option to download the desktop client. Now, this is the piece I wanted to start off taking a look at, the OASYS desktop client. If your employees download this little piece of software, what they will be downloading is this application right here. This is your OASYS desktop client. Now, this little application can be deployed to anybody inside of your organization that you'd like. You can give it to 100% of your employees. You can give it to 10% of your employees. You can give it to 0 of your employees. It's really yours to do with as you will. We think it's a neat little application, gives you some real functionality, so we just make it readily available for all. This desktop client piece, as a bit of the margin of the page side note, is dependent on a real-time information stream with the phone switch. So if your PBX doesn't give us real-time data, this little desktop client is not going to work unless you're doing a Vox recording type. We need some sort of real-time indication that your employees are on the phone, so we need that real-time information stream to make the desktop client work. Assuming that your PBX gives us that real-time data stream, here's what the desktop client can do. First and foremost, it's going to let you know every time you're on a phone call. So I'm currently talking to another extension here at OASYS. This call is in progress. Even actively right now, I am on the phone. Where the real controls come into play is you get this little button in the left-hand side with a microphone. It allows me to start and stop the recording of my calls on the fly. And this is our first really big implication for the administrative side. If your employees have been granted permission to use this button, they would simply click on the microphone icon and they could start the recording of their call, or stop the recording of the call as the case would be in this scenario. Click this little button, the red dot goes to grayed out because I have that level of permission. Right now our call is no longer being recorded. As soon as I click the button again, I once again initiate the recording of the call. This recording is being captured. So on the fly, I have the ability to pick and choose when this call is going to be recorded, and maybe more importantly, when it's not going to be recorded. Now, if Joe and Jill taxpayer do not have the ability to use this button, they can click it till their finger falls off and nothing's going to happen. Their calls are recorded 24/7. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. There will be no change in their recording status. The opposite side of the coin, though, just worth mention, if the president, the vice president, the CEO, someone in the hierarchy of the company, is set up to not record, we can certainly every time they get on the phone have this grayed out. But if they got an important call come through, they're getting ready to do an important conference call or a phone interview, they could on those scenarios choose to initiate the recording of their call, and then that call would be captured. So 99% of the time they're not recorded, the other 1% of the time they can choose on the fly to capture those recordings. Lots of flexibility in how this little button can work, and it really depends on how you've been configured, what side of the coin you've been set on. And those are going to be big decisions for us as we go about administrative programming here in just a few minutes. The next major thing the desktop client can do that has implications for us as administrators is it allows for the attachment of information. There's a custom button bank that you can deploy out to your employees or that they can set up unique to their specifications, where they can attach information that's pertinent to their recordings. Now, I've got a couple of these little buttons set up for silly training and demo purposes in the past, but if somebody were to ever get upset with me, I can click a button on my desktop client that labels this particular conversation as having an upset customer on there. The labeling of that information can then pick or choose whether or not this call is recorded. If I was set up to not record by default, I could maybe have a trigger that says every single one of my upset customer calls, those are the exceptions to the rule, those are the recordings that I want to have kept. Same thing with my bomb threat button. If I click the bomb threat, that's probably a pretty important call. That's one we're going to keep recorded and retain in our records. The rest of my recordings would simply be disregarded and deleted, assuming I haven't typed any additional information on the call. So information you attach to the recording can also be used for those recording purposes. That information can also be used for backup and archive settings, after call actions. So depending on the information that I attach to the call, I can tell the system to keep it for a longer period of time or delete it sooner. And I can also have additional actions triggered as a result. So maybe I would send an email to my manager or supervisor every time I click the bomb threat button, indicating to them that a bomb threat has come through inside of the company. They better jump on that recording, give it a listen, and see how dire the circumstances might be. So there's lots of things that can take place as a result of our administrative programming if your employees are using this desktop client piece. If you'd like to take a look at the additional features of the desktop client or how those button banks are programmed, please feel free to participate in the OAISYS Basic User class, where we go into great detail about the customization and the use of this desktop client. For our sakes, though, as administrators, those are the two major features that I wanted to point out about this little application. So, having taken a look at the desktop client, the next major thing I want us to take a look at is that true backbone interface that we call the Management Studio. So if you click the button to the left, what you would download to your computer is the OAISYS Management Studio software. Now, as the last mentionable about this download screen, this is a one-stop shop for any given person inside of your organization that needs to have access to the OAISYS software. You would use the same web link to download the software onto the president's computer, the vice president, Joe and Jill taxpayer, or the sales manager. Everybody's going to access the download of the software in exactly the same way. But you never need to revisit this download screen from any given computer. It's a one-stop shop. So once you download the Management Studio and or the desktop client, depending on what your needs might be as a user, any subsequent time you need to get into the software, you can just go right through your startup menu. Go to Start, Programs, OAISYS, and there you'll see the Management Studio and or the desktop client waiting for you to be used again. If you'd like, you can even right-click on those out of the startup menu, create icons on your desktop, simple double-click on those to bring up the software, and there are even specific settings that can be set in the preferences wherein every time you boot the computer, those applications would automatically launch and log you in, and they'd be ready to go for you even first thing in the morning. So this is only a one-stop shop download page where you'll need to get access to the software from any given computer on your network. Assuming then you click the little Download Management Studio software button or come in on any subsequent visit through your startup menu, what you would be interfaced with is this right here. This is where I get into the OAISYS Management Studio software. The first thing it's going to ask you for is a username and password. Now, out of the cardboard, we don't have any profiles built for you aside from one. That's the SYS administrator. So in order to log into the software on your first go, you're going to log in with the username sysadmin, SYSADMIN, and the password is the same, SYSADMIN. Now, if your administrator or your resellers helped create some profiles for you and you know you have full administrative access on that profile, by all means, you can just go ahead and log in as that profile with those credentials, and you can get to the administrative side and do all the same programming I'm about to show you. Assuming that not to be the case, sysadmin's there for you out of the box. Go ahead and log in with those credentials, and it'll take you immediately to the administrative side of the software. Now, the sysadmin profile only has access to do administrative duties. If you had logged in as your everyday username or password, you would have to first navigate to the lower left-hand administrative button to bring up the same perspective that we're taking a look at here. If you don't see that administrative button, chances are your profile hasn't been granted full administrative access, so you'd want to log out of the software and re-log in as the sysadmin so you can do your administrative programming. Now, hopefully you can notice when we log in as the administrator that it's set up in a very similar folder tree system to Windows Explorer or Microsoft Outlook or any of the other sorts of software that you might use with this folder tree scheme. All the different elements of programming that we'll take a look at over this administrative class or any of the additional administrative courses that you might participate in will be done through navigating this folder tree system. So it's a very simplistic and intuitive interface to kind of go about the programming. The first major topic then I wanted to show you as we got into this management studio were some system verification points. Because traditionally when people pop into the administrative course, I can make the assumption that your system has been installed, it's connected to your phone switch, and it should be up and running in its most basic form. If it's not yet been so, that's certainly okay if you're just getting some training ahead of the curve, but that's a nice general assumption that I make under most circumstances. So I want to show you how you can just go to verify that that is in fact the case and that your system is up and running and recording calls. On that front, I'm going to show you the two things I promised. One, proactively how to check on your ports, and two, reactively how to set up some alarms. First things first. If we want to proactively check on your system, we can come to this area that's called the Recording Manager. If you expand out the Recording Manager, there's a little tab underneath where you can check on your ports. Your ports are those things that we are recording. We have quite a few different ways that we can record calls at OAISYS. We can record at the trunks, we can record at the stations, we can record analog, PRI, T1, lots of different configurations. So ports is just our generic term for those things that we are recording. Go ahead and click on Check Ports. You'll see in real time to the right exactly what's going on inside of your organization. Now we'll soon discover whether or not my engineers are working on my system, and as the case would be, of course they are. Luckily, you don't have engineers working with your system all the time, but I currently do, doing some testing on other servers. But this is a fantastic teachable moment, because when I come to my little check port screen, what you will notice is that I have alarm notifications across the board. It's letting me know that something's not working correctly. Currently, the PRI that was plugged into this server is disconnected, and this server is not actively recording any conversations. If you see a screen like this when you check on your ports, it'd be a really good time to give your reseller a buzz, have them come out, pay you a visit, figure out what's going on with your screen. However, for just such scenarios, let me show you a slide that I always have waiting in the wings. I promised my last PowerPoint of the day. This is what your typical check port screen is going to look like. It's a real-time indication of exactly what's going on inside of your company at any given moment. So, when I took this screenshot, there were actively 6 calls taking place inside of my organization on the 23 available lines. We have 23 lines coming in and out of our organization that we can hold simultaneous conversations on at any given moment. So I could see that 6 of those calls were actively being recorded, and the rest were just sitting idly by, waiting for somebody to pop on the horn. The fact that it's disabled beyond that's perfectly okay. We only have 23 lines here at OAISYS. Makes perfect sense that those are the only ones that have either that idle or record status. So why do I like to show this screen? My reasons are basically twofold. First and foremost, you get a nice real-time indication of exactly what's going on in the company. So at a quick glance, I can just see how things are behaving. Ours are again tied to trunks, so I can see what those 23 trunk lines are doing inside of my organization. Sometimes, depending on your tap type, this extension column is a little more revealing, and these will be actual extensions that you're monitoring if we're doing station-side recording at your company. So these would quite literally say extension 1000, 1001, 1002, 1003, or whatever your extension numbers might be inside of your organization. And I can just see in real time what's happening on those given extensions or those trunk numbers. The second reason, and maybe the more beneficial, it's great for some basic troubleshooting. Because here's a scenario that happens often enough, not all too often, but certainly making it worth mention. You're going to get Ted from accounting come down and knock on your door. And he's going to tell you that there's something wrong with his recordings, his extension's not being captured, because he went looking for a call from the VIP customer last Friday and can't find the darn thing anywhere. Well, instead of you having to go down to his station, take the phone off hook, dial movie phone, unplug it, plug it back in, shake it around, doing the standard troubleshooting things that we do, we can get to the root of the issue. I can have Ted go to his extension, take it off the hook, dial movie phone, 1-800-FLOWERS, call his wife or anybody in the world. I would want to be looking at this screen when he places that test call. If I see his extension or one of these lines go from idle to record in real time when he places that call, I know we're recording his calls. Chances are he just doesn't know how to find the darn thing, which is a completely different issue than his calls not being recorded in the first place. So instead of spending my time troubleshooting and figuring out what's wrong with his phone, I can spend my time wisely, get Ted in my office, search for the recording, find it, let him listen to it, life is good. So great little screen where you can see in real time exactly what's going on with your system and how those different lines are behaving. So that's the first window I wanted to show you, that nice proactive view of what's going on inside of your company. Now, having showed you that window, I don't imagine you're going to spend the rest of your days staring down the screen and keeping vigil on top of your system. So let me show you an area that I think is a little bit more reassuring, and that's our alarm programming. Wherein if something catastrophic does happen with your system, we'll send you notification about that so you can get that problem remedied just as soon as possible. Makes sense to me. So, in order to program some alarms, I want to take you down here to this little alarm services area. If you click on alarm service and expand that little folder out, you'll get an area underneath where you can program some rules and actions. Click on the rules and actions table, it'll populate over to the right exactly like mine has here. Now, when it comes to programming alarms, this is basically a two-step process. First and foremost, you're going to tell the system who to inform if there's ever a problem with the box. Secondly, you're going to tell the system what you consider a problem. What are those things worthy of notification? So I'll walk you through both steps here. You can customize these alarms to inform you of whatever it is you need to keep your finger on the pulse of. In order to do that, first off, you want to program one of these actions. Now, in either of these fields, you can certainly add a new addition by clicking on the Add button in the lower right-hand corner. However, out of the box, you should see one of these actions pre-existing. You should also see one of these rules pre-existing. So instead of adding new ones into the system, I always choose to update those that already exist, just so there's less clutter on the screen. So, personal recommendation, double-click on that existing action, and you'll get a window that pops up just like the following. Now, there are a couple things in this window that you'll want to make note of. First and foremost, you want to make sure that there's a valid recipient in the to line. Out of the box, this is something silly. noname at noname.com, test at test.com, something of that nature. So you're going to want to go into the system and program a valid email recipient for who's going to get these alarms. In this case, I've programmed in here Eric_Ames at OAISYS.com. I am the recipient of these alarms. You can certainly have this sent to as many people as you want. If you want, you can semicolon delineate. I could also send a copy of this to Bob at AOL.com or anybody in the world that I'd want to send these alarms to. Probably a good idea to have it go to multiple recipients in case you're on vacation or homesick with the kids or homesick with yourself. Make sure somebody's getting notifications if anything catastrophic should happen on your server. Once you have those little recipients filled in, the only other thing of significant importance here is in the message area, you want to make sure you have both the title alarm and the message alarm. In order to get those fields filled in fact, let's act as if they aren't here, delete those out of my screen. There's buttons that'll appear in the lower left-hand corner where you can insert those variables. So if I come to the message area, click the title alarm, it'll insert alarm title in brackets, hit enter, hit the message alarm, it'll insert alarm message in the brackets. Those are two very important fields. That's what's going to be replaced by the information that the system's trying to tell you in the event that an alarm should trigger. So in the case of my server, as a working example, the alarm title would say something to the effect of, Eric, your PRI is unplugged. And in the message, it's going to tell me, Eric, you better plug that PRI back in because until you do, we're not recording anything for you. So it's going to give you specific information about the alarm that's being triggered so you know how to fix that problem. Without those two variables in there, you're just going to get a blank email that says OASYS alarm. You're not going to have a clue what specifically the server is trying to tell you, so it's going to be of very little worth. Once your email screen looks very much like mine, go ahead and click OK, and you're going to have that action set up. That's what's going to occur if an alarm should ever trigger. It'll send an email to both Eric and Bob explaining the different dimensions of that alarm. Where this comes together makes a little more sense. When we come down to the rules table, we can tell it what we consider an alarm. So if you double click on this existing rule or click the add button in the lower right hand corner, that'll pop up a window where we can now designate those things that I want to be informed of. And this is broken into a few different areas, so we'll take it top to bottom here. First and foremost, we have different severity levels. These are kind of our umbrella categories of alarms that you might want to be interested in. They range from critical all the way down to informational, little silly nice to know things. What I generally recommend to all customers, have someone, if not multiple people, informed of all critical alarms. If you have that configured, you are good 98% of the time, if not more. Those are the alarms that are going to be truly catastrophic to the recording of your calls. Those are the things that somebody needs to know about. But you can certainly choose additional alarms if you want. You can do it by whole umbrella category, or you can even do it by selected variables. I don't need every single major alarm, but I'd like to know when my backup and archive destination are full. I don't need every single informational alarm, but I'd like to know every time somebody logs in. I'm the president of the company. I'm the only person that should ever log in. If anybody other than me is logging into the software, I want to know about it. So there's a multitude of different alarms that you can have yourself informed of, but as I mentioned earlier, having somebody informed of all critical alarm will cover you 98% of the time and beyond. Once you choose those specific things you want to have notification about, the bottom part here is logistical. How often do you want to get those alarms? Well, you don't need to bombard my email account every 5 minutes. How about you send me an alarm every hour? If I haven't remedied the problem within the next 60 minutes, send me another alarm, and just keep sending those to me until that problem gets resolved. And then last but not least, what's the action to be performed? In this case, anytime something critical happens, I want to email Eric and Bob, tell them about the problem every hour until that alarm gets remedied. Once I've set up my alarm, I go ahead and hit OK. That's now in place. Anytime something critical occurs, we're going to get that notification. With these alarms, you can set up as many of them as you want, and that's why we have these set as tables. So if you want to have a bunch of people set up as recipients and get them informed of the things that are of importance to them, you certainly can. If you want to be informed of all critical alarms, that's fine. If you want your assistant to know the major alarms, maybe the president to know a few informational things, you can set up as many of these corresponding rules with actions as you would like. Keep everybody in your company informed of those things that they would need to know about. So that's how we set up our alarms. That's how we get notifications to you of anything that you would need to know about. In conjunction with that proactive window where you can see what's happening in real time, those are the two places where you can really keep your finger on the pulse of this server and make sure it's running reliably as it should be. So with those verification points under our belt, the next thing I want us to take a look at is the creation of those lists and call filters. Lists and call filters are going to be very important programming elements that we'll use as we set up our recording rules and after call actions and all of the remaining topics that we have for this basic admin class. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate for the first time down here to this lists and other resources area. Specifically, if I open up the list types below, this will show you the majority of the different types of discriminators that we have in the software for the sake of our recording rules, our after call actions, backup and archive settings, and all those other elements of programming that we'll be taking a look at this course and in our additional administrative training classes. Click on the top one here to get some white space on the side. There are quite a few different flavors of discriminators that we can use in our software for programming purposes. Some of the more common ones that I see used are based on ACD agents or groups. So if you want to have the system only record specific agents or groups, we can certainly do so. Or if you want to keep calls that go to your sales queue for longer than you want to keep calls that go to your customer service queue, you can set up your designations for backup and archive based on ACD information. ACD is automatic call distribution. It's how we route calls inside of many organizations. Thank you for calling OAISYS. For sales, press 1. For customer support, press 2. Things of that nature. We can set up the rules based on the queue that they're delivered to or the specific agents that log into those queues that might be receiving the calls. Other flavors of discriminator. Commonly used are ANI. These are caller ID numbers. So we can set up rules to never record your husband or wife's cell phone number. Always record the VIP customer's phone number. Keep those VIP customer phone calls for longer than we're going to keep calls to or from my kid's dorm room. Caller ID, a nice way to discriminate what to keep, what not to keep inside of the software. DID DNIS lists, those are numbers dialed to reach your company, so those can be your discriminators. Based on what your customers are actually plugging in to get a hold of your organization, we can tell the system what to do with your recordings. Schedule lists, also used very commonly. Only record calls Monday through Friday 9 to 5. Don't ever record nights and weekends. Keep calls that happen Monday morning longer than we keep calls that happen Friday afternoon. Whatever you want to base discriminations on in terms of time of day, that would be based on a schedule. Another really common one are any flavor of information that we might be attaching to call. Extra information, account codes, typically done by way of this desktop client that we looked at earlier. So if I'm clicking buttons on the desktop client to label things on my recordings, that information can be my discriminator. Keep calls with upset customers longer than we keep calls with bomb threats. Keep all the calls where I made a sale for 6 months. Delete all the calls where there's people needing a refund after 2 years. Any of that information we attach to a recording in real time can also be a discriminator for us. The one, however, that's used most commonly is probably the one that I skipped over, and that's based on extension. Extensions is a very common way to pick on people inside of an organization. I want to record all the calls that go to Bob, Betty, Steve's extensions, but I don't want to record the HR extensions or the president's extension. Because people traditionally sit at the same phone from day to day inside of most organizations, this is the flavor that's used most commonly amongst most elements of programming. However, regardless the flavor discriminator that you want to use, the groupings are set up very much the same way across the board. And that's true for any of the different programming purposes we're going to be taking a look at. If I want to pick on any specific one of these variables, I just click the list type of interest. Once that's highlighted, I go to the right-hand side and I add a new grouping into that flavor. In this case, we're going to pick on extensions. So if I click the plus icon on the top right, it's going to ask me what group of extensions do I need to enter. And I can name this anything that I want. I could call this Bob's calls, Betty's calls, or I can keep it very cookie cutter and generic. Maybe today let's go with a sales theme here. This is my sales team. And I can identify all the extensions that make up my sales team. At which point I can program them to do various things. Keep their recordings, keep them for a certain period of time. Every time we see a sales call come in, send an email to the sales manager. Having identified this group inside of the software, it's going to give me lots of flexibility to do things with this group of extensions. So we give it some sort of a title, and below we make sure to click the checkbox to create a call filter for this list. The call filter that we make in conjunction with this list is actually the thing that we're going to use for programming more times than not. So you always want to be sure when you give a grouping a description to click that checkbox to create a call filter. You go ahead and hit save, and that'll create the grouping inside of the software. Now, if we expand out that flavor, expand out extension lists, we'll see that sales team just waiting in the wings. But at this point, it's nothing more than a shell of a team. So in order to give it some value, some definition, we click on sales team, and in the right-hand panel, we can start now divvying out who it is specifically that's a member of my sales extension group. So I can start perusing through these extensions, and the way that this is oriented, the far right-hand column are all the different extensions inside of my organization, and the far left-hand column are all of the members that are part of this different grouping. At this point, there are 0 members inside of this group. So what I need to start doing is perusing all these extensions and finding the people that make up my sales team. Hold down Control and select a few people at random here, kick them over to the left, and now I've just defined that there are 7 people inside of my sales grouping. So anytime I talk about this sales team, the system's going to know exactly who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Eric, Julie, the boardroom, the break room, Doug, Greg, and the customer service group. Those are the people that I'm talking about when I talk about the sales team extension list. I can then use that for recording rule purposes, after call actions, backup and archive, any of the number of things that we're going to be taking a look at programming throughout the remainder of this course. All of the other flavors are created very much the same way. I can create groupings of agents. I can create groupings of ACD groups. I can create groupings of schedules. Anything that I'd like to pick on based on these list types, those can be my discriminators. However, there's one extra thing I want to throw into the mix. We can also make judgments and discriminations based on things that are not of list varieties. And that requires that you just go straight to creating the call filter itself. That call filter, which is usually created as a byproduct of setting up a list type, we can create directly to give us a little more flexibility. And here's how that's done. If you come to the calls folder underneath, you notice we have our area here for call filters. If I click on call filters, we should already see one, the sales team that we just created earlier in relation to that sales team extension list, but I can create my additional call filters on the fly if need be. Just by highlighting call filters, I come over to the right, click the plus icon, and it's going to allow me to create a call filter independently of a list. Now what you'll see here is that I can name this anything that I need it to be. How about we pick on a call direction? Let's call this our outbound calls. And in addition to all those different flavors of lists that we looked at being able to discriminate off of earlier, if I scroll to the bottom, there's additional criteria that I can use for discrimination. The one here is call direction. Inbound calls, outbound calls, or internal calls, or intercom calls. So I can make the call direction a determination. Only record my inbound calls. Never record calls that are outbound. Okay, that can be a discriminator. I could also do it based on call durations. Never record calls that are less than 50 seconds long. Chances are that was a salesperson, realized they called a business, and they hung up on us. Always record calls, though, that are longer than 2 minutes long, because based on that duration, that's a call that might be of interest for me to go back and listen to. Matched answered, if it was answered or not answered, that can be a discriminator, and whether or not it was recorded or not recorded. We can do things like an after call action where we can say if the call was not recorded, go ahead and delete the record of that call ever having existed. Also a very common one for trunk side recording. If we have records of your internal calls taking place but no audio associated with them, we can set up an after call action rule that would say always delete internal call records because there's no audio associated with those calls in the first place. But in order to set that rule up, we'd have to come in here and make a discriminator that could help us to identify those internal calls. So those are some on-the-fly call filters that you can also create. When you go ahead and have that set up as needed, you can hit save, and that'll add the call filter to the list of discriminators that you can use for various programming purposes. Another thing that you might have mentioned while I had that window open is we can also make these elaborate. So if you want to combine multiple elements to make a very complex recording rule, you certainly can. We could do things like always record calls from my husband or wife's cell phone number that go to my extension and my extension alone. So we can mix and match multiple variables, put a bunch of elements in there, and get very complex with our call filters and the setting up of our rules that we'd want set up inside of the software. So we can mix and match multiple call filters to add to the complexity of our rules. If you will, creating lists and call filters is kind of a logistical pre-step. When we go about the programming of our recording rules or our after call actions, we would need those groupings set into place ahead of time so that way we know how to program that stuff in the software and the software knows who we're talking about. So all of those groupings that you would need for the different elements that we're going to look at here as we continue along this basic admin class would need to be set up as lists and call filters ahead of time for that programming to be available. Having then created those lists and call filters that are going to be important to your company, the next thing I want us to talk about is backup and archive. Backup and archive is where we manage the hard drive. It's how we make sure there's always room for the new calls coming in, while at the same time making sure we've safely stored all those old calls that are still important to your organization. And that's all going to be programmed in our housekeeping area. So moving back up to the server folder, if we come to housekeeping, this is where we're going to groom your hard drive. This is where we're going to program how the backup and archive is going to be maintained. Now, within the backup and archive discussion, there are actually quite a few different ways that you can pick and choose to maintain your hard drive. The first of those that I'm going to show is the default. So I'm going to come down to System, Stage, and Purge settings, and I'm going to show you how our system has historically taken care of your hard drive and groomed your recordings. Then we're going to transition into the new editions of version 7 and beyond, which give you a little bit more flexibility in this programming. So when it comes to System, Stage, and Purge settings, there are a couple things that are worth note before we start the programming side. First and foremost, an idea of how our system behaves. Anytime a call comes in, there are basically two things that are going to happen to that recording. One, we're going to make an actual PVD file, that's our own proprietary audio codec, and we're going to stick it to a partition or a separate hard drive on the server. Secondly, we're going to make a SQL database entry about that record that we use to mine the call and find it again when it comes time for listening purposes. That is also stored on a separate partition or a separate hard drive on the server. So when we talk about backup and archive, we're really going to need to program backup and archive of two different destinations. One, the actual audio files themselves, and two, the SQL database table that references those PVD files that make them searchable when it comes time to find those recordings in the future. Secondly, I want to point out the behavior of how our backup and archive process works. Let's say we have an OAISYS call recording server that's on your network. At minimum, an OAISYS recording server is going to hold for you 56,000 hours of calls. That storage will vary depending on the size of the server that you purchased, but at minimum it's going to be 56,000 hours of recording. It can go up to 100,000 hours of recording at the medium-sized server or 200,000 hours of recording at our largest server. Regardless the inherent storage of the server itself, we can choose to always pipe calls as sort of an overflow destination to a network storage location. This can be a NAS, it can be a SAN, it can be a USB-based external terabyte hard drive that you go pick up at your local discount electronics retailer and plug it into a USB port on the server itself. Regardless of what that destination might look like, let's say it is a 1 terabyte unit, 1 terabyte is going to hold for you about an extra 200,000 hours of recording. So our system stores at a very good rate, an extra hard drive can be attached very quickly and easily and relatively inexpensively. Here, though, is the best part about this archive model. If we are at our computers and we want to listen to a call that happened maybe 2 years ago, we could do a search through that SQL table and look for the recording on the hard drive of the box. If that call is no longer on the hard drive, the SQL table will be updated and it will tell us where that recording was last stored. Assuming that that network location is still intact and still maintains the record, we could then stream the audio of the call to our computer in milliseconds. We're talking computer time. In fact, you as the user are oblivious as to where the call is coming from, and frankly, you don't care because you're listening to it in real time. So with our staging technology, we can move calls to an overflow destination and keep those calls visible and accessible for as long as we have record in the SQL database. So long as I can find the call in that SQL database, it'll go find the record for me, stream that to my computer, and I'm listening to that recording. So those are two dynamics that are worth mentioning as we begin programming the dynamics here of our backup and archive settings. In the system stage and purge settings area then, the first determinations we need to make are when and how we're going to work with those recordings. First off, we can choose to stage or move those recordings to some other storage location based on the age of the document itself, when it was last modified. This is not a default setting. By default, we do not move your recordings at any specific period of time, but you can choose to override that and move your recordings to some location based on a date range. Sometimes it's done as early as 1 day. If you have a network location that's RAID 10 with quadruple power supplies, that's a really meaty unit, you might want to choose to move your recordings over to that location at that time. Otherwise, generally speaking, we do the moving of your recordings based on threshold levels. What that means is we're going to base our determination on how full the hard drive of the box is. And as you can see, there's two different database levels that we can monitor. First, we can stage the recordings themselves off of the partition where the recordings are stored or the separate hard drive, again depending on which unit you've purchased. And when that recording destination hits 90% full, it'll move the oldest 5% of recordings to whichever location that you've chosen as your destination. Or, in the case that you've chosen to delete your documents, it would simply delete the oldest 5% of your recordings, making room for the new calls coming in. Moral of the story is that we always want to make room for the new calls that are coming into your system because those are traditionally the calls that you want to listen to more often than not. The older recordings generally become of less importance, and you want to listen to the new calls that came in to see what the meeting time was or what the customer complaint was or whatever it is that you might need to reference. The same sort of thing can happen with the partition or the hard drive that holds your SQL information. When that partition gets full, we can delete or move the oldest 5% of that information to another location, making room for the new records that need to be written into the database. So we can do this based on the hard drive level or the age of those recordings or those records themselves. The choices that you have as to what the behavior is going to be are the staging options below. So we can choose to move those recordings and automatically purge the records of those calls so they're no longer in the SQL database when we go looking for calls. Once a call is safely moved over to some storage location, we take away the reference in the SQL table, just kind of cleaning up the SQL table and keeping your searches a little bit faster. When you choose this option, all it's going to ask you below is that destination, what's your overflow point, and you can simply click the Browse button and choose a location on your network that you're going to set up as the destination to overflow those recordings that no longer have room on the hard drive of the server itself. If you plugged in a USB external hard drive, that would appear as a drive letter when you click Browse. Otherwise, if you're browsing to a network location, you would find that location on your network and be sure to push the calls over to that destination. That destination does need to have full read-write authority, so be sure as you're setting up that destination folder, you give the folder full global read-write authority. 2, you can move the documents from the recording drive and purge the recordings later, and when you choose that option, we get the additional option below as to when you want the records of those calls to be deleted. So we can keep those reference links in the SQL database, which would give them accessibility when they're moved over to that destination, the actual audio files, that I could still stream them from the location that they've been stored at. Or last but not least, I can simply choose to delete the recordings. So when my hard drive gets 90% full, delete the oldest 5% of records, make room for the new calls coming in. Or when my database gets 90% full, delete the oldest 5%, make room for the new records of calls so that those new calls will be searchable inside of the software. So the when determinations are the above options, and the what determination is the middle option, what you want to have done with those calls. Do we want them moved? And if so, what to do with the SQL database? Or do we simply just want to delete all record of the call ever having existed in the first place? The last determination that you get is a media type folder. This is used if you have any intention of burning the calls to CDs, DVDs, or SCSI tapes, any sort of physical media where you can keep those recordings safe. If you do have intention to do physical burning of those calls, we can simply choose a media type folder size, saying for this example, I want a DVD 1 layer. That's going to be 4.7 gig. It's going to go ahead and start making folders for me 4.7 gig at this location. So when it comes time to do my burning, I don't need to figure out how many calls are going to fit onto a DVD. Instead, the system's done all that organization for me. I'll find a bunch of calls that are exactly 4.7 gig or smaller, depending on how they can fit in those recordings, and I can simply drag and drop those folders into Nero, Raxio, Easy CD Creator, whatever I use for my burning software, and I can make quick copies of those recordings in a physical format. So media type is just used if you have intention to burn those calls to some sort of physical media to simplify that process. Those then are the standard ways that we can do backup and archive. It's not discriminating any particular calls over any others. It's collectively working with those recordings. Once all of my calls hit particular thresholds or date ranges, I'm telling the system what to then do with all of the calls that qualify for whatever thresholds that I've set. The new addition to version 7 and all versions beyond are the user-defined stage and purge rules. And this is where you can get even more granular, wherein if some calls are more important to your organization than other calls, based on the call filters that you've constructed, we can set priorities. I can keep my sales calls for longer than I keep my customer support calls. I can keep my outbound calls longer than I keep my inbound calls. Any calls that come into a specific DNIS number, I might want to have those exported to a folder where I can put on my FTP site for a customer, and any calls that didn't come on the DNIS number, I can go ahead and delete because nobody needs to listen to those. I can set a whole multitude of different preferences of how I want to work with my recordings, where I want them stored, and how long I want them to be kept based on any of those call filters that we previously constructed. All you need to do to set this up, find the appropriate call filter, kick it over to the left-hand side, and make your determinations of how you want this to behave. Now we're picking on those specific extensions that we define as being part of the sales team. So what do I want to do with the calls that are of the sales team? I can have those stored for longer periods of time. I can have those moved to specific destinations. I can have them put into different media type folders. So I could go ahead and browse to a location. Let's say I want to keep these calls on my external hard drive, but I don't want any other calls to be stored at that location. Now I've set that destination. It's going to move the sales calls and the sales calls alone to the C drive, leaving everything else to abide by those system, stage, and purge settings that I previously set up. That's another good mentionable. Anything that's not specifically designated here as a rule that you want to have precedence would just abide by the generic system, stage, and purge settings that you can configure for the remainder of the calls on your box. So we can set up all of the specific staging and archiving choices that you have here for any call filter, and then also then have the system abide by all other rules for any call that doesn't qualify. Last but not least, when it comes to housekeeping, if you want to keep tabs on your hard drive to see how it's behaving, there's a little tab here that's called Drive Usage. The Drive Usage tab, just a nice little area where you can quickly index and see what's happening with your OASYS server at any given moment. Specifically, the areas that will be of interest to you, I can see what that recording's destination is in terms of capacity. Right now, my recording's destination is only 1.43% full. I got quite a while before I have to worry about it hitting that 90 target threshold and deleting any recordings. I can see what my SQL database area, how full that is becoming. It's 10.6% full, so I might want to be concerned about it at some point if it's starting to push that 90 threshold. Those are the records that reference me back to the actual audio files. And if you've set up any staging destination, any place that's going to overflow your recordings, this is where you can keep tabs on that destination to see how full it's becoming. So if your hard drive does push that 90% threshold, start piping calls over to this destination, you'll want to keep an eye on how full it's getting, because once it hits its capacity, you're no longer going to have an overflow destination to put those recordings at, so it's going to just start deleting calls in lieu of the fact that it doesn't have anywhere to move them. So those are the things that you might want to keep your finger on the pulse of in terms of backup and archive, all of that contained in the little drive usage area, just a quick index of what's going on with your server. So with those options, you can either set all-encompassing staging rules for how your systems are going to be deleted or moved to other locations, or you can set very granular rules for which calls are going to be of more interest, which calls we can go ahead and do without. Once you've made those determinations, another really big choice that you're going to make is which calls are going to be recorded in the first place. Which calls do we actively want to keep on the hard drive? Which could we do without whatsoever recording? And that's going to take us to our discussion of recording rules, or what are often called recording triggers. If we come up to the recording manager area, here's where we're going to determine what to record and what not to record in the first place. If we expand out recording manager, the area of specific interest is going to be within the recording rules folder, and we're going to click on call recording rule. And when you click on call recording rule, it'll pop a window to the right, and here's where you make your initial determinations of what you want recorded and what not recorded in the first place. Here's how this is programmed by default. As soon as you get your system out of the cardboard, we have what's called the default call recording rule, and it's programmed to record, which essentially means that anything that our system's aware of is going to be recorded right out of the box. If that's how you want your system to behave, you don't need to program anything further. Everything that our box is aware of will simply be recorded and kept on the server. If you do want to get more granular though, you can use any of the call filters that have been created in your server, and we can set specific rules for those call filters. Now, we have the two that were created earlier. Let's kick over sales team. Here are those few extensions inside of the company that we don't want recorded. So I can come over to the left-hand side, set the corresponding rule, do not record the sales team, but by default record everybody else. Go ahead and hit save. The system will do just that. Anytime it sees a call that was on the sales extensions, it'll be sure to delete those recordings. By default though, any other call will be kept in the software. Vice versa, you might want to set the rule to always record the sales team, but by default, not record anybody else. You could certainly do that as well. You can leverage the default call recording rule however you'd like. So if there's only a few people in the company that you actually do want to be recorded, it might be easier to set up a group of those individuals than it would be to set up a list of the people that you don't want recorded. So that can really go on either side of the coin. Keep in mind that those recording rules can be based on anything. account codes that would be attached to a call, ACD agents or groups, call directions, days and times, anything of interest to your organization that can be your discriminator. The most important part of this process is setting the correct rules. So I want to go into a quick little discussion of these different recording rule options that we have over to the left. The first thing that I want to mention about these recording rules is that they are built on a hierarchy. So higher rules are always going to trump lower rules in the software. Reason for that: some companies will set up a bevy of recording rules. They might have 50 or 60 different scenarios when they want to record and when they don't want to record. If any of those rules would ever conflict each other, let's say we have a rule to always record the VIP customer's phone number but never record the president's extension. Well, what happens when the VIP is talking to the president? Those rules are going to conflict. So we need some sort of resolution. That hierarchy is what's going to resolve. If the president's rule is higher to not record than the VIP's to record, it's not going to be recorded. Vice versa, if the VIP's rule is higher than the president's to not be recorded, that call is going to be recorded even though it was on the president's extension. So that hierarchy is going to be very important depending on the intricacy of your recording rules. The second thing I want to note are these little outline sections for no manual override and manual override. This goes back to the desktop client that we were talking about earlier, wherein I can be set to have a rule, but I can manually override that decision and stop the recording of my call, maybe even start that recording again. In order to have that functionality to control my recording, I need to be given manual override capability. If you set people up with no manual override rules, these are hard-coded rules. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Your calls will either never be recorded or always be recorded. You don't have any toggle ability. However, if you set them up in the manual override section, this is where we give them the ability to toggle that. They could be set up to not record by default, and if they click the button, it would start the recording of the call. They could be set up to record by default, wherein if they click the button, it would stop the recording of the call on the fly. The one that I skipped over here, do not record with restart loopback. This is a neat little feature wherein we're always buffering your calls. So whenever you get on the phone, like TiVo or your home DVR, we're going to buffer that conversation. If I'm set to not record the president, the vice presidential types, and I realize at the very tail end of that call that this might be a good one for my records, I can click the recording button. The system would then loop back and keep the entire buffered conversation. So I have the entire thing there for my records. If somebody really laid into me, I might want to keep this call, be able to reference it again in the future. If I think this call is going to come back to haunt me, that might be a decision that I would make at the last moment. Very important thing to note with the restart loopback. You can only click that button prior to the hang up of the call. If you hang up the recording, you've missed your opportunity to click the button and loop back and keep the conversation. So you'd have to trigger that while the call's still live. Assuming you trigger it while it's still live, though, it'll keep the entire conversation. And then last but not least, we get this option to record sometimes. So if you just want to do a random percentage of calls, you certainly could. Let's randomly record 20% of the sales team calls. I don't need them all, but I'd like to have some of them there for spot checking purposes. You can certainly do that. And then they would also have the manual override ability that if this call was particularly important or particularly unimportant, they could still start and stop the recording of the call and override that 20%. So those are the different recording rules that you have. You simply choose the appropriate call filters, click on the corresponding radio button, hit save, and the system will behave just exactly as you told it to behave. It'll record those calls of interest. It will not record those calls of uninterest. So having checked on those system verification points, created some lists and call filters, programmed backup and archive, and programmed your call recording rules, those are the core functionalities that are traditionally looked at on the administrative side during the initial setup. However, there are two additional features that we're going to discuss in this basic admin class that are used by some industries, and those are our after-call actions and our custom call columns. So the next thing I want us to take a look at then are those after-call actions. After-call actions are programmed here in this recording manager area. And if you come down to after-call actions and give that a click, it will populate a table over to the right where we can set up some elaborate after-call actions. After-call actions, much as their name implies, are actions that can take place immediately after a given call of interest. Now, as you'll notice from that grid on the right-hand side, all of the different call filter types that we've created in the software up to this point can trigger an after-call action to take place. Currently, we have just the two flavors, but we could have any number of call filters in place that were of interest to my company. Now, what I can do with those different call filters is set up a corresponding action to take place, wherein after I see a call that qualifies, in this case, after any call goes through one of my sales extensions, I can have the system perform some sort of behavior. The options of actions that can take place corresponding to any one of these call filters are pretty numerous. If you go down to the lower area, this is where we can control those actions. Within this members column, if you click the plus button here towards the top of the grid, it'll pop a window and simply ask what sort of action would I like to have take place in relation to this call filter. From the drop-down menu here, I'll show you the different flavors of actions that can take place. First and foremost, we can have the system simply delete the recording and the call record associated with that recording. This is one that I mentioned while we were creating the call filters, wherein I said we could have all intercom calls deleted or all calls less than 30 seconds deleted, so that way they would no longer be inside of the system, taking up that space. We could also have this correspond to an account code. So if I labeled something specifically on a recording, the system would know after the fact to go back and delete any calls where that account code had been attached. Log information to a file. This would simply keep a file of all the records of calls that corresponded to whatever the call filter might be. How many calls had upset customers on them, how many calls went to the sales team. It's just information that would be placed in a file. I could also have the system run a program. If based on a call coming through, I needed to get into some other piece of software or have something speak with another program, I could have the system do just that. Send an email is a very common one, wherein if any call triggers, I can have somebody notified via email about that recording. So if I label a call as having an upset customer or a bomb threat on it, I can send immediate notification once that call is completed to the customer service manager. Insert call info. Any call that qualifies, I can put some piece of information into a field. That information could then be searchable criteria later on, or it could be used for API integrations. Insert call data field. Again, a custom field of information where I could attach information to a call once that call is completed, making it thus searchable or something that would be available for API integrations. Or I could have this recording exported. I could send it to some folder location where I could keep all of those calls in one central repository. So if I needed to be able to post calls to an FTP site of a specific flavor, I could get all those calls quickly and easily in one destination transferred to the FTP site. Or if I need to have them on a folder for great training purposes, I could have them quickly sent to that location where I could then work with those recordings in another format. Maybe export them as a WAV or an MP3 or some other more media-friendly format than our native .pvd. So we can set up as many of those actions as we want. Let's go ahead and say we want one to delete the recording. I could call this one delete, go ahead and hit save, and now I can have an action that corresponds to that particular call filter. You would set up any one of those different choices just by filling out the fields that they ask you. What program do you want run? What email address would you like this sent to? Where would you like the call exported and in which format? Depending on the choice of action that you make, you would simply fill out the fields to do what you need the system for it to do. But as you can see now, I have one action set up. It's to delete the recording for any sales team call. So if anybody in those sales extensions gets a recording, my system would know to automatically delete the call after the fact. Those recordings would simply be purged from the software. If I didn't want that action to pertain anymore, I could simply kick it out of there. Now you can see the number of after call actions associated is 0. Nothing will happen for those sales calls aside from the other things that I've programmed in backup and archive or within those recording rules. So after call actions, neat little thing, just additional functionality that can be done once a call is completed for notification or informative purposes. And the last topic that I want to cover with you in this basic admin class are the creation of custom call columns. As more and more industries are getting into call recording and adding more and more information to their calls to work with other pieces of software or APIs, or just for the sake of making those calls quick and easy to find again in the future, we're seeing a lot more demand for the custom creation of call columns and data fields that would be specific to that industry's role. If you want to create some call columns specific for your organization, attaching unique pieces of data for your calls, that's going to be done down in the Lists and Other Resources area. If you expand out Lists and Other Resources, the area that you're going to want to go to in particular is inside of the Calls folder, and you can click on Call Data Fields. As you'll notice in the right-hand window, there are lots of these call columns that we have pre-constructed for you out of the cardboard. In fact, any of these on the right-hand side that you see in brackets are our system available columns of information where we attach information about your recordings. To set up one unique for your industry, or as many as you would like, with call data fields highlighted, you come to the right-hand side and click the plus icon at the top. This is how you can add a custom call column with custom options for your industry. Click that plus icon, it'll pop a box. And here you can designate what you want your column to be able to contain, what sort of information you want it to store. Now, we'll set up one of them here. Maybe I work in interior design, and I need to be able to attach the color that someone's interested in for their drapes and curtains. Okay, I'm going to make a column for color, where I'm going to be able to designate the color of interest for these people, so I can do a search at the end of the month. How many people were interested in red? How many were interested in blue? How many people wanted black? Or if I just can't remember any particular customer, I can find their call based on caller ID information or any other variables that I use for searching purposes. Once I pull that record up, I can reference the column to remind myself which color they were interested in. So, completely unique field, might be of interest to your company, might not, but we'll call this one our color column. Now, I can go ahead and choose many different ways that I can put information into this field. It could be a simple yes/no value. I can put a date and time into this field if this is something that I'm using for scheduling appointments' sake. So as I schedule appointments, I can put date and times into my call columns, and I can have that now as my reference of when that patient scheduled the appointment. It can be small text. In this case, though, I'm going to choose a unique one that I again see very commonly being used, and that's a tiny number. Because what it'll allow me to do is program what we call enumeration values, which are essentially drop-down choices wherein if I click a button, instead of having to type in my own field of information or having to select a date and time from a calendar, I can prompt a drop-down menu of options where I can pick from among a choice of pre-designated options. So that'll be the flavor that I'm going to choose for this particular call column creation. Additional choices that I get: how often can it be edited? This might be a one-shot deal. I can edit it one time while I'm on the phone and that's it. I could give it a default value and never have it editable, but what's most commonly done is edit always. I can go back to this column at any point in the future and I can adjust that information that I attach. If I accidentally labeled this call as being interested in red, I might have to go back and change it and say they're interested now in blue. Sticking with that default value idea, I can have this automatically populate a default value so everybody's interested in blue unless they say otherwise, or I cannot have that value included and I would have to then designate something to fill in the value, which is most commonly done. Below that then are the enumeration options that I mentioned when I said I'm choosing the tiny number very intentionally, because I can start making some choices from a drop-down menu. So I can define enumeration values. Again, this is very commonly used, so I make this one the choice very intentionally. And I can make my choices blue. That would be my number one choice. I can also make one black. That's value number 2. And I can continue this as many times as I would need. Red is going to be value number 3, and I can plug in as many of these enumeration values as I'd like in my drop-down menus. When I click then on the button that I can set up on the desktop client or in the field on the historical side, it'll present to me in a drop-down menu those choices of interest. Keeping in mind, though, this can be anything. I've used this for debt consolidation companies. The first option on the drop-down is a new customer. The second is paying back in full. The third is needs an extension on the loan. So you can pre-designate those things that are common on the phone calls that you participate in that you would want to attach to your recordings. Or hospitality. This person needs an early check-in, late check-in, champagne on arrival. Standard choices that you see while you're on the phone that I can attach to my recordings. All of that again then is searchable criteria or just there for data purposes. How many people needed the late check-in? How many new customers did we have on the phone? How many people were interested in blue? This is all information I can now put onto my recordings. We'll leave this as a simple 3 choices. You could make it 100 choices if you really wanted to, but those are going to be the 3 of interest to me. Last but not least, you'll want to leave these remaining 2 checkboxes chosen. We'll create a call column for this in the historical call view, and we'll also make this criteria searchable when it comes to finding the call later on. 2 standard default values that I would always recommend leaving checked. Now, if you go ahead and hit save, you'll create that custom call column. It'll be available for all users of your software. On the historical side, you will see that as a search column. You will see that as information about your recordings. And on the desktop client, you can code buttons to attach that information to your calls in real time. As a bit of an example, getting back to our desktop client, kind of bringing things full circle, when you create those drop-down menus, it might look something like this. Here I am once again still on the same recording from earlier. I have a custom drop-down menu called Car Type. If I go ahead and click that button, instead of immediately attaching information, it prompts me with the drop-down menu that I've pre-constructed. And there are all the different car types that we've added in as enumeration values. All I need to do is click on that one of interest. I can say this one's about a Ford. Go ahead and hit OK, and I've attached that piece of information onto this recording. But I could just as easily set up a button that's called Color. When I click it on the drop-down menu, I would see the three choices that we programmed: black, blue, and red. So all of this now is information I can be attaching to my recordings that's very valuable to me in the future. With that then, we draw our basic admin class to a close. Those are all of the standard administrative things that can be programmed for both our Document and Tracer software users. System verification points, groupings via lists and call filters, housekeeping duties, backup and archive, recording rules, after-call actions, and custom call columns. Having seen these topics, you can now focus on the additional admin classes that focus on your software version. If you're a Document user, there's one additional admin class. It's called Document User Creation, wherein we'll go about creating user profiles for your employees and doling out their respective permissions so that they can use the user interfaces as you want them to use those interfaces. For Tracer users, there are two additional admin classes. There's a Tracer User Creation class, which teaches how to create user profiles in the Tracer software. And there's an additional Tracer admin class, which teaches how to program some of the more advanced features of our Tracer software package. If you have any questions about any of the topics that were discussed in this class or any other classes, please feel free to visit our website at www.oasis.com or call into our headquarters at 888-496-9040 and speak to a member of the training, sales, or tech support teams. Otherwise, I thank you very much for participating in our basic admin class and wish you the very best with your system. Thank you very much and have a great day.